Yes, I would like to focus the presentation here today on a work that I did a few years ago. Where I was invited as to curate an exhibition of sound art in public space in the small city of Struer, which is located in northern part of Jutland. And since this was about sort of artistic work and the intersection between artistic work and research, I thought this was sort of an interesting project to bring to the table here, as and maybe also that falls within the frame of the curatorial practice that it somehow sort of operates, quite often operates in this intersection of how to qualify an artistic work and try to set a framework for an artistic project. So what I will try to do here today is to present this project. I will present my reflection, my ideas, my kind of theoretical research to it, and I will try to sort of open with a few of the examples of the works that were made for this exhibition. I consider both sort of as legitimate and sort of valuable contributions to this sort of space of reflection that I think this exhibition was, at least in my perspective. So when I was invited to develop a project, sort of I had sort of my main sort of considerations. Was first of all sort of a question of public, sort of how to engage an audience in a sonic artwork, which is sort of an ongoing sort of interest of mine. And particularly it becomes very sort of prominent in a location like a small city of 10,000 people in northern Jutland, so where you have a big audience, a very small audience, an audience that might not necessarily have really asked for being approached by sonic artworks. So there's a question of sort of how do we find a public and how to actually engage a public in the situation and make that relevant. The other question is the question of sight, which I think is more on a personal level, so I think it's a really interesting one. I grew up in a small city myself, and I always have this feeling of traveling after living in Copenhagen, traveling to small cities. There's a sense of feeling that I recognize going to smaller cities, because I have the sense of having been there, but there's a certain distance, not only in geographical travel, but also somehow a temporal one. So for me, it also there's a question of how one remembers stuff, how one remembers sight. Something is happening. Am I in the right place?
You need to have some light.
Oh, sorry, I was into the. So those are some of my sort of initial sort of considerations. What I did then was try to sort of propose a frame for the project, which was based on the notion of the Soundmark. The Soundmark would be a starting point for sort of research of my own part, but then also as a framework for a dialogue with artists that I would then invite to sort of contribute with works that were also sort of artistic reflections on this notion of what a Soundmark might actually mean. So, of course, the Soundmark is, as you probably know, sort of inevitably tied to the theoretical enterprise of Canadian composer Amory Schaefer and his acoustic ecology and soundscape theory. However, I think there's a space for expansion. I think there's definitely room for reconsidering this notion of how of what this could actually mean. Just sort of, part of my presentation here will sort of be a little bit of a sort of the theoretical legwork that I did behind that. Sort of part of that has been published in an article I wrote with another author, Jakob Kreuzfeld, in a Public Art Dialogue, which Åsa Stjerna was the editor for this particular issue. So she will be very familiar with what I'm going to say right in the following here. But just sort of trying to frame in sort of both the potential, I think, and maybe also the limitations of the notion of the Soundmark. Sort of Amory Schaefer introduced the concept in 1977, publication The Tuning of the World, and pointed that the identification and preservation of soundmarks is essentially a cultural heritage task. Like a landmark, the soundmark expresses something unique for a place, something that could and should be maintained. he states, the unique soundmark deserves to make history as surely as a Beethoven symphony. For Schaeffer, soundmarks carry the identity of a place and the regard of a community, be it foghorns, carillons, or the sounds of boiling sulfur at Tikitere in New Zealand. In the glossary of soundscape terms published as an appendix to the book, Schaeffer defines soundmarks as the term is derived from landmark to refer to a community sound which is unique or possesses qualities which make it specially regarded or noticed by people in that community. Among the examples that he mentions are Salvatore Mundi in Salzburg and Big Ben in London. Schaeffer also introduced less easily noticed examples like the scrapping of heavy metal chairs on the tile floors of Parisian coffee houses and the virtuoso drumming of Austrian bureaucrats with their long-handed rubber stamps. Ta-ti, ta-da, ta-ti, ta-da. Curiously, such examples seem to operate within the register of a much more sort of personal and felt, of something much more personal and felt than what lies within Schaeffer's more cartographic definition which is the scope that he normally employs. So while the notion of the soundmark is intriguing, it's hard also to sort of ignore that Schaeffer's theory is maybe questionable, or at least sort of it can be a lot of it sort of can be discussed. It's to a large extent sort of quite naive account of sort of how the auditory field of attention sort of works. And sort of over the years, he has received sort of critique for a number of positions. Just to bring up a few, sort of Douglas Kahn sort of notes Schaeffer sort of takes over a categorical imperialism from John Cage and defines and valorizes the world from a musical parameters. Jonathan Stern, in his often quoted Audible Past, sees Schaeffer's contribution as part of what he defines as an audiovisual litany, a discursive lineage from Marshall McLuhan and Walter J. Ong that, in contrasting sound with vision, ascribes certain historic values to sound and carries with it deeply conservative ruminations about the shape of human history. So, I mean, Schaeffer's theory finds inspiration in diverse sources as John Cage, Marshall McLuhan, and Heritage thinking. And probably the most problematic aspect with regards to the question of the soundmark, at least, sort of, might be his theory's emphasis on the heritage thinking, the insistence on a conservative and conserving approach to contemporary sound. And Schaeffer's soundscape thinking generally sort of criticizes modern urban environments and favors the rural and pristine. And the soundmark concept is similarly developed to notice and preserve sound. Right. So the question that sort of was on my mind was sort of then how could we? I mean, can we think in different terms and the soundmark along sort of in a different theoretical framework? And it just so happened during that time when I was doing this research, I was reading Deleuze and his reading of Marcel Proust's in Search of Lost Time. It's a wonderful little book called Proust and Science. And my idea was to then sort of could one think sort of the soundmark theory as a kind of sign in the way that Deleuze considers Proust's account, right? So. Just to sort of try to sort of expand on this, according to Deleuze and his notion of science, they are first and foremost sort of to be considered in their capacity to affect something or someone. Deleuze outlines the affectual nature of science in his reading of Marcel Proust in Search of Lost Time, and here one finds a reflection on the dynamic workings of the signifying process. And if just to sort of elucidate that, so one can sort of contrast Deleuze's approach to a classical mode of a classical model of communication, where one finds, which is usually considered sort of based on a network of information, sort of this Shannon's model from 1946 that a lot of information theory sort of is based on here. I mean, the virtue of a model such as this sort of entails a quantitative concept of information that sort of describes sort of how information sort of flows through a system. And the merits of this model is the universal the possibility of a universal application independent of specific media, etc. So, however, by the same token, one can critique this the same model due to the fact that the quantitative notion of information entails an idea of communication that is indifferent to whatever content is being communicated, and following sort of this, whatever nodes are in the network, sort of being a sender or receiver, are sort of unaffected by whatever is being transmitted through it. So this, I mean, the model persists, but the communication is just being channeled through the network. Against such an account of communication, the Deleuzian understanding of design emphasizes the effects entailed in the process of communication and points to the consequences of communication, actually of how information affects an individual. Design, then, is not a transparent or neutral medium channeling information. Signs are enigmatic entities that point to something unknown for the receiver. At the same time, signs entail a kind of a violence, in that they force the individual to engage in the process of interpretation. So Deleuze writes, sort of, the sensuous sign does us violence. It mobilizes the memory. It sets the soul in motion. But the soul is, in its turn, excites thought, transmits to it the constraint of the sensibility, forces it to conceive essence as the only thing that must be conceived. Thus, for Deleuze, unfolding the sign is not a passive registration of information. Rather, it involves a process of learning, which must be understood against the principle of a process of constant becoming, sort of, which is this Deleuzian idea that everything sort of is constantly becoming something. In the reading of In the Search of Lost Time, the deciphering of sign, as Deleuze sees it, is a theme for the protagonist throughout his life. The deciphering of sign also forms the background of the narrator remembering the past, not as discovering of a truth, but as a process, eventually leading to the recognition of what is actually happening, of the underlying dynamic of the process that transcend the material presence of things. So rather than trying to unfold a semiotic framework that is founded on a stable relationship between a signifier and what it represents, Deleuze is occupied with how the process of signification can be understood within a larger dynamic context. Significance as such must be understood as something that unfolds in a particular environment and against the horizon that is constantly changing. With regards to the sound mark, coming back to this account of the dynamic nature of a signifying process allows us to see the sound mark as a sign through which the individual engages auditorily with an environment. This engagement must be understood as a dynamic process that is less a matter of acquiring formal or objective knowledge about the environment. It's more about knowing that one inhabits an environment. One learns the sound mark in a process in that one adopts to its presence, right? So rather than going to the Schifferian notion of the sound mark or something where we can go and find that Malmö sounds like this. I mean, we recognize because there are these certain sounds, so we can go and find them there. It is a matter of sort of that one has to sort of be in the situation. There's a shift from sight to situation that is inherent in underlying sort of this dynamic perspective. So as Deleuze reader Rune points out, following Deleuze's own example from difference and repetition, one can consider the aspect of learning along the lines of the metaphor of learning to swim. Learning in the perspective of the swimmer is less about gaining formal knowledge about how one ideally swims or objective information about movements of water, but rather a mode of bodily interaction with an environment that unfolds in a system of forces between minute and momentary impulses from the liquid medium surrounding the body and a complex set of bodily response movements. Using the analogy of the swimmer in water, there's no reader of an environment independent of the environment. And coming to the sound mark, there's no listener independent of the space that one inhabits. So just like the Proustian sign, the sound mark is not a signifier with a fixed signified. Rather, the sign is an entry into a virtual field that unfolds of a sound mark as an auditory sign is about unfolding a virtuality, what Ronald Bow terms a world. So through the sound mark, the individual and the environment enters into a mutual becoming. The individual that is listening is being marked by the sound mark. So it's not just the sound mark that is located in a certain place, it's also by actually experiencing the sound mark, one is also being marked by it. So there's a sense of, there's this dynamic sense that means that the listener is never the same. The listener is always changing, and through the listening act actually is also changing the background for repeated listenings or new experiences. So there's a lot of theoretical references that and intriguing sort of philosophical questions still here, but I will kind of sort of leave this sort of space of reflection sort of as where that serves sort of as the background for the invitation that I then sent out to the artist to then say, okay, let's think about this situation. How can one consider as what a sound mark might be in a dynamic sense? And I will just sort of very quickly sort of just mention sort of two works that contributed, sort of one being the work by Alejandra and Aaron that contributed to the exhibition with a series of posters, and this was based on sound words, onomatopoeia, and their various manifestations in different languages. By translating 3 onomatopoeias into the most common languages spoken in Struer, the work pointed to the fact that even locations outside the larger cities are part of a global system of migration, transition, and communication. In this way, the work opened for a critical perspective regarding Schaeffer's notion of the sound mark as something that is defining a local community, but rather opened a set of questions with regard to what is the imagined community that identifies itself with a given location, and how do we even define a local sonic phenomena if the ears of community are tuned towards global events. The other work that I would like to sort of mention here that I think probably sort of signifies or really sort of was sort of elucidating sort of examples of how one can sort of think about the installing a sound work dynamically in a situation was by a Danish artist called Christopher Axelbo. In his contribution, sort of he has asked a performer to on a daily basis during the exhibition period, sort of walk through the central part of Struer carrying a megaphone. At designated spots during the walk, the performer stopped and told the story of the boy who cried wolf through the megaphone. While carrying its own sort of set of themes, the work, through strategic introduction of a daily call in the public space, created a presence of a voice in the city, and following also produced a potential listener. Due to its repetitive nature, the voice gradually became a familiar presence rather than a performative event that stood out against the horizon of sonic events in the city. So this work by Christopher Axelbo also points towards the understanding of the sound mark that is less about the properties of the audible phenomenon, but rather about ways of listening and reacting. The gradual transformation of an event that initially called for attention, sort of as a guy walking around with a megaphone, sort of into sort of a daily auditory phenomenon. So there he is again, sort of, or he just sort of slips into sort of the background of attention because, yeah, he's just present as the daily what happens during a day. This shift sort of corresponds to the notion of learning. As suggested earlier. It entails a shift from the new and extraordinary to something familiar and predictable. In the context of the classic narrative that is appropriated, Aesop's fable, in the work, this familiarity of course entails a risk of forgetting the real danger of the message that is being transmitted. However, it points to the dynamic of sort of how a sound mark might actually sort of work. The work thematically pointed to a dynamic inherent in the notion of the sound mark and its corresponding mode of listening. A sound mark is less about the formal properties of the sonic phenomena, but rather finds a significance in how one incorporates its presence. And through this corporal learning, it implies a transformation from the extraordinary event to sort of a familiar presence. So just summarizing here, sort of the works presented at the exhibition in Struer provide sort of an interesting and thought-provoking suggestions of how one could comprehend the soundmark beyond the scope of sort of its original sort of conception. The works in various ways explored particular mode of presence of sonic phenomena and a corresponding mode of relating to them. What could be termed sort of soundmark listening entails a scope of awareness that allow phenomena to exist in the field between sort of ground and figure, but could also be seen as instantaneous of a corporally bodied mode of relating to the surroundings. The idea of the soundmark that has been presented lends itself to an aesthetic that is less about the mark as something spectacular or monumental, but rather to a complex dynamic whereby the individual is engaged in an environment. Significant for most of the works that was proposed for this exhibition was that they kind of lacked the big sort of wow factor. I mean, so a lot of the people, and particularly also people from the municipals, probably maybe had fantasized about sort of these large-scale sort of productions of sort of something that really stood out. Say, there's the work where a lot of these works, both this kind of performance and the posters, and for example also these kind of small stickers, sort of employ sort of strategies sort of how to sort of merge into sort of everyday situations, and became a mode of trying to sort of interfere with the sight, and again sort of creating a particular, calling for a particular mode of attention that is less about sort of the focus of attention, but also something that can exist at the periphery of attention. So there's sort of an interesting sort of question that lies there again, sort of how to consider a work that I think the works here sort of called for. So yeah, so I think again, for me anyway, sort of there was some really sort of fruitful insights learned also through this process of how to go about it, and a lot of learning also sort of how to see sort of how a small city sort of reacts to this kind of presence. Yeah, maybe that's a good place to stop.